What's going on, YouTube? We're back here for another video, and today we're going to be detailing out some of the better weapons that you want to level up early on when you're actually leveling some of these classes. We'll be going through each one of the classes, key highlighting some of the weapons you'll want to start leveling with, as the big thing about this is as your character levels, also will your weapon level. So basically vice versa, the experience you're gaining for each one of the classes to gain some of those perk unlocks is also going to gain you the capability of upgrading that weapon to different levels of rarity that are going to further increase the actual DPS output and performance of the weapon, and give you a little bit of a perk tree alongside that with each one of the weapons you'll be using. So it's one of those moments where if you start off with one of these classes, you find one of these weapons that you think is going to be good, and then next thing you know, halfway through you may even end up at the third level of difficulty and you just find that the weapon's underperforming, so you decide to switch off to something better. Or maybe you watched a video and possibly thought, you know what, that's going to be a better option, but you find yourself in that situation where you're underperforming because after you've transitioned over to a lower leveled weapon that hasn't even been brought up to the green variant level, your DPS output has completely dropped, and you're either going to have to go down in difficulty or possibly even drag your whole team with you down to a lower difficulty just to get that weapon in line to perform at the level it should be when it comes down to the difficulty you're already at with the level of your character, which that's going to be frustrating, and we're going to try to alleviate that with this video. But that being said, we've got more than a few things to cover, so let's get straight into it, starting off with the tactical class. Now, when it comes down to the primary weapon for the tactical class, there is a wide variety available to you, but I would say that there are only 4 of these options that are actually that much worth the while, and that's going to be the bolt rifle, the heavy bolt rifle, the plasma incinerator, and the MELTA rifle. But the number one that everybody seems to be choosing right now is the bolt rifle, for the simple fact that each one of the rarities going up has a grenade launcher attachment with it. And I will say the grenade launcher is definitely clearing out crowds. It is performing quite well, and it is something that is a little bit of a broken weapon. Now, this is probably the number one weapon that a lot of people will want to use with the tactical class. It's definitely one that has been a shining performance when it comes down to the third and last or highest difficulty inside of the game. I've seen this thing blowing people away, and when it comes down to the perk tree, you can find yourself in a situation of being able to cause self-healing with this. With the fast regeneration on the top portion of the perk tree, we have the capability of killing an enemy restores armor by 0.5 seconds earlier. This means that basically the base amount of time that you'll need in order for your armor to fully restore itself or start restoring itself is going to be 25 seconds. So each time that you're killing any one of these enemies, it's going to drop that timer down by a second. And you can realize pretty quickly, especially with that grenade launcher, how many of those smaller enemies you can clear up pretty quickly and start gaining those armor slots back. And if you find yourself at a point of lower than 30% of your health after killing 10 enemies, especially with something like the grenade launcher, gaining 5% of that health back is going to be quite substantial. And it says 5%, but I'll be honest, it's almost something that feels like 25% of the health coming back with this. So you can end up in one of those situations where you have 30% and almost feel like you bump yourself up all the way to halfway, and then if you find some contested health on top of that, it just makes it even easier. But the grenade launcher attachment for the bolt rifle is really carrying this weapon, and a lot of people are loving on this. Now, for me personally, the heavy bolt rifle has just been a personal favorite of mine. It's one of those weapons that just feels well-rounded. It feels good to fire. It's got a decent magazine to it. It's got decent damage to it. The fire rate's nice. The accuracy is good on it. It's just one of those all-around, well-rounded weapons. It's not the most broken, but I don't know whether or not in the future they may be nerfing or buffing any weapons in the coming future, but overall, you just can't go wrong with a heavy bolt rifle. And if you just want a reliable ranged weapon for a primary weapon with the tactical class, you just can't go wrong with this one. But there are some more heavy on the DPS side options that we have available to us, such as the MELTA rifle. And I will highly suggest if you're somebody that enjoys shotguns and you want to be up close and personal and have some major damage output, the MELTA rifle is going to be one of those top tier weapons, and you will be using this with a different class pretty much as the main weapon, and it will be very destructive, as well as using it with the heavy version of it in the heavy class that gets even more destructive. But yet again, this is another one of those weapons that also has the capability of self-healing, and with this, considering it is one of those weapons that's like a shotgun, but it's like a plasma flame shotgun, it'll be eating through those crowds of smaller enemies, so you'll be gaining that armor back in no time. You just won't be gaining the same amount of health back with this one as you would with the bolt rifle with grenade launchers. And what I would suggest when it comes down to the perk tree for the MELTA rifle, if you start with fast reload, go over to adamant reload, hit the HP, and you could go down to the second HP if you really want to guarantee that 1 second per time and just maximize your capability of gaining that armor back, and then hit right over here at fast reload, and then go upward towards extended magazine over to fire shot, and then find yourself at the end of it with elusive fire, which is going to have that perfectly timed dodge, also increases that rate of fire. That's just going to further increase your overall DPS output with this weapon. But if you're not too worried about doubling up on that HP, I would highly suggest going up towards the Great Might and gaining a little bit more damage out of this route, another 20%, especially when facing off with the Terminid, and then having that capability of further increasing the magazine size as well as the rate of fire. And this will be a great build for the Melta rifle, even for the Vanguard class as well. Now, the last weapon to talk about for the tactical class is going to be the Plasma Incinerator when it comes down to the primary weapons. This one is going to be all about the DPS and a little bit of that primary weapon that can be utilized to clear through some of those crowds. Once you charge this up, it does have a splash radius to it, and it can be quite destructive, as well as the class itself having perks that end up benefiting the overall damage output of the Plasma Incinerator. As you'll notice with Plasma Boost over here, when the Plasma Incinerator is 50% overheated, its damage is increased by 30%, so by the time you've basically technically gone through half a magazine, you'll notice it from the crosshair, there'll be that little red by the point it hits that halfway point to being overheated and needs to cool off. That's the point where we're going to gain that additional 30% increase to damage. Now, why this is important to talk about is there is a way to actually synergize with the perks on the weapon itself. If you start off with the top column going with common cooling, common shots generate 10% less heat, but the next one over with rapid cooling, after killing 10 enemies in rapid succession, the weapon does not heat for 5 seconds. So if you can find yourself in a position where you're possibly heating up that weapon to 50% or possibly even getting close to overheating it, and you have the capability of landing a charged shot into a crowd of enemies that may be about 10, and which should be fairly easy with this weapon, you could end up having that 5 seconds of over the 50% threshold with that 30% increased overall damage, and just be charging those shots and landing some massive amount of DPS out from that Plasma Incinerator. But I would also highly suggest just going across the entire top row, as it's going to end up giving you that shots charged faster. You're going to have even faster charging shots if you're below 30% of your health. You're going to have damage from charged shots. You're going to have common shots generate less heat, and the charged shots generating less heat, so you've got more capability of firing off every single time. And on top of that, perfectly timed dodges, which will happen quite often, 25% more damage output, and then synergizing that with common speed as well as the charge speed to gain a little bit more of that projectile speed, giving you the capability of landing those shots a lot quicker than they would be before that, which sometimes can be a little bit frustrating. But overall, the Plasma Incinerator synergizes with the build, and if you're looking for something that has a decent amount of DPS, interesting type of playstyle instead of just a grenade launcher, this is a great option to kind of switch over to, especially if you've already fully leveled out the character and you already went through with the Volt Rifle. It's a good thing to transition over to. Coming right after that, when it comes down to the secondary, this is one of the #1 weapons that you want to level up pretty quickly, and it'll be on more than a few different classes, so by the time you use this and you start leveling it up, it's just going to synergize with a bunch of different classes. If you're looking to jump from class to class, more than likely this is going to benefit you in the long run, as the bolt pistol is going to be one of the #1 weapons for 4 out of 6 of the classes. And honestly, it'll be one of the only secondaries you'll be able to use out of some of these classes. And when it comes down to the versions of the pistol, I would highly suggest are going to be the ones that are more accuracy. That is just going to give you the capability of landing those headshots more often, really conserving on the ammunition you have, and just maximizing the total damage output of this weapon. The more accuracy you have on it, the better your landed shots are going to be, and the better your clearing power with this weapon, if not just some of that damage output towards some of those larger targets is going to be from this weapon. And it gets even better when it comes down to the perk tree, as if you follow along the top of the perk tree, you're going to end up minimizing or decreasing the overall maximum spread of this weapon, as well as giving you the capability of instantly reloading this with gun strikes, which is going to happen quite often, again reducing that spread. And then we start increasing the overall damage output, especially for headshots. But the biggest one is going to be the Elite Hunter. After killing a Majorus level or higher enemy with melee weapons, headshots deal 50% more damage for 5 seconds. So anytime you go in for a finisher with a melee weapon, this is going to end up being one of those moments where you've gained 50% increase to your overall headshot damage with this weapon, which stacks with the fact that we have Headhunter twice already on here. So technically you're looking at a full-on 70% increase to headshot damage for 5 seconds right after this. And then the last perk that you want to get is Extended Magazine. increasing the magazine size by 15%, just giving you more of those rounds capable of throwing down range. And sometimes this can be a huge benefit to you when it comes down to clearing through some of those crowds, as in harder difficulties, more than likely there's going to be moments where you run out of the ammo on the primary weapon, and having a secondary that has that capability of further increasing its overall DPS output is going to save your life more than a few times. And the bolt pistol comes in handy in more than a few different situations, and sometimes can end up saving you that ammo that you need from the primary for some of those later extremists or boss units you may be facing off with. And that way you can utilize this pistol in order to take out some of those elite units or Majora's units, or at least put them into the finisher state a little bit easier. But you just can't go wrong with the bolt pistol, and it's going to be one of those pistols that you'll be using across multiple classes, so this is one that synergizes really well to level up early on, as it'll benefit you from class to class. And if you have the legendary version on one class but you haven't leveled up another class, you'll still be able to bring over the full perk tree alongside that legendary variation of the pistol, so you'll have a little bit of a DPS advantage when it comes to starting off with that next class with this pistol if you already have it leveled up. And when it comes down to the melee weapon, all we have available to us is the chainsaw sword. And one thing that I will make very clear when it comes down to the melee weapons is always check the defense rating just right here. If it says balance, this means that you have the capability of being able to parry and not just block. If it says block, you will no longer have the capability of parrying enemies, which you really don't want. And a lot of times, if you're looking to have the best capability of parrying enemies, you want to find one that says fencing, like this one. And what fencing is going to do is basically extend that timer of perfect parry timing. So if maybe you're a little bit slower on the timing of hitting that block button or that parry button whenever you see that blue circle or one of those strikes coming towards you, fencing is going to help you in those moments. And even in some situations, it may even help with some of the lag that you may be experiencing some of these matches. But overall, that's probably one of the number one things I would say when it comes down to the melee weapon. But with the chainsaw sword, for me personally, when it comes down to the perk tree, I'm going all the way across the top for the simple fact that I'm really going for the very tail end, which is each consecutive light attack increases our light attack melee damage by 3% all the way up to 30%. With the chainsaw sword, I'm really just looking to have this kind of deal as some additional damage towards Majora's enemies, but really we're looking for that cleaving power to have a little bit of crowd control with this. Kind of have that balance of a little bit of DPS for some of the elite units, but at the same time being able to just churn through some of those crowds, and it just benefits the tactical class. When it comes down to the assault class, I'm just not a big fan of this one, but I will say bolt pistol is going to be the way to go, as the heavy bolt pistol is just not going to benefit you in the long run. You really need something that has a little bit of clearing power, and we've already covered the bolt pistol, so we'll keep on moving from this point. Now when it comes down to the main primary weapon, obviously the Thunder Hammer is truly going to be the best option. It's going to give you the most DPS output as well as the cleaving capability for a little bit of that ad clear, and it's just going to work the best when it comes down to the jump pack. You do have the option of the fist or the chain sword, and in some ways sometimes I would almost say the chain sword might end up being better, and if you'd like something with a bit of combination to it, you could go with the power fist, but ultimately the best option is going to be the Thunder Hammer. I'm not a big fan of this class. It feels like a glass cannon to me, and honestly I think everybody's opinion on this is almost universally the same. It just seems to be one of the classes that lags a little bit behind, doesn't really exactly have like the capability of truly being the DPS tank that you really want it to be when it comes down to the melee. And I'd honestly say it's one of the classes I'd probably avoid. I'm going to be leveling this up in the future and making some type of build out of it and trying to get it to work, but for right now I'm just not a huge fan of it. Coming up right after that, we've got the Vanguard, and with the primary weapon for the Vanguard, the MELTA rifle is going to be the top tier. This is the one that I would say you always want to go with, and if you're going to play Vanguard, this is going to be the ultimate choice for you, because you're going to be closing the gap with this class all the time. You're going to be pushing into elite enemies all of the time with the grappling hook that you have available with this, and you're just going to be in the face of the enemies, and it's going to benefit you in the long run, as the perk tree, as before we stated, the MELTA rifle is going to give the capability of restoring that armor and gaining that health back in those moments. And since you're kind of that fast, up-close type of personal playstyle, the MELTA rifle really complements the Vanguard class. But if you want something that's a bit of mid-range or maybe a little bit of range, you can't go wrong with the Instigator bolt carbine. But honestly, with the way that the Vanguard plays, the MELTA rifle is the perfect weapon for this class. On top of that, we will have the bolt pistol with this, and it's going to be working out fine. And when it comes down to the Vanguard melee weapon, I go with the combat knife instead of the chainsaw sword, because for the simple reason that we are not using the melee weapon to have that crowd control effect, especially if you're using the MELTA rifle. That thing is going to be perfect for crowd control, just chewing through those smaller units, and then we're going to be using the combat knife for just digging into those elite units and digging in as fast as possible. Now with this, I would prefer to have the fencing, but considering with this class we do end up having a little bit more favor when it comes down to the open timing windows of perfect parry and being able to perfect dodge. It ends up blending quite well with the balance, as we'll get more speed out of the legendary variation of the Blood of Vassus, and we're going to end up having more damage out of this than something like the Liberation, which is just going to end up slowing us down, cutting us down by 3. We're going to need more of that speed, and that speed's going to end up giving us that additional DPS output that we'd rather have than just one more additional strength on top of that. And when it comes down to the perk tree, I've just gone across the top, as the last thing that I'm really looking to get is just while performing a light combo, I want to take 15% less of that range damage. That way, anytime that I'm in the crowd, I'm just capable of being able to tank while I'm trying to finish off that next target and giving me a little bit more damage towards some of the terminus level enemies, because when it comes down to it, the MELTA rifle doesn't exactly have the largest amount of ammunition to it, so once we've run out, we're more than likely going to have to switch to our pistol or possibly the combat knife. And with having 20% additional melee damage towards terminus enemies, this is going to work out in our favor. Any one of those boss units will be up in the face of them. We'll be using that grapnel to pull over, and we'll be capable of being able to dish out that damage as well as perfect dodge and perfect parry some of their moves. And yes, you can perfect parry some of the boss's moves as well as some of their light attacks. It doesn't always need to be that blue circle, but anytime you see that red circle, do be sure to hit that dodge as quickly as possible and get some of those gun strikes in, and then just keep stabbing away with that Blood of Vassus. Coming up right after that, we've got the Bulwark, which I will say right now, when it comes down to the Bulwark and the Heavy, we have the option of having the bolt pistol, but the plasma pistol is going to be the better option for the simple fact that, one, it does have massive amounts of DPS output from it. If you charge the shot, it is almost feeling like a primary weapon. It is deleting some of these elite units and doing some chunky damage towards some of those boss units. But the big reason that we'll actually go with the plasma pistol is the simple fact of charging that shot and being able to get that range shot on some of those units that may be trying to call in reinforcements. We'll actually, with just one charged shot, be able to stop them from calling that in, and it's going to save us in more than a few moments when some of those enemies are just out of reach of our capability of hitting them, especially with the Bulwark class, since we're all about melee and defense. We need something to compensate for those moments when there's something just out of reach that is calling that reinforcement in. The plasma pistol is going to come in handy for every one of those scenarios. And when it comes down to the perk tree, I've gone along the bottom path that's giving me a little bit more additional damage, especially once killing more than a few of them. If we charge up this shot, it does have that splash effect, and there's more than a few times where you can easily end up killing 10 of those smaller enemies, as well as just damage from charged shots. We're getting more of that damage increased on terminus enemies, as there will be times where, since we're the Bulwark class, we do have the melee strength for us, but it's not always going to be in the most beneficial way, considering we're not as fast as something like the Vanguard. So you may sometimes want to play a little bit of a distance when it comes to certain boss units, and even more so when it comes to dealing with those boss units that are the cacodemons, the floating ones. They're probably one of the more irritating enemy types that you'll be facing off with, especially if you're playing as the Bulwark class. And if you don't have somebody on your team that has that range damage capability of taking them down quickly, you're going to find yourself in a situation where you're going to be charging quite a few shots in order to try and take them down. And this may help in one of those moments. But right after that, we've got the Plasma Collection, 20% increase to our energy reserve. On top of that, I do have shots charged 20% faster. That way, I'm just capable of getting some of those charged shots on those enemy units that are trying to call in those reinforcements even faster, especially if I don't have the time to immediately get on top of them. Maybe they've already gone halfway up before they call in that reinforcement. This could save you in those moments. But just after that, we're also efficient charge, just gaining 2 less of that energy lost every time we're using that charged shot. And then last but not least, every time we perform a perfectly timed dodge, you deal 25% more damage for 5 seconds, which can be pretty beneficial, especially in something like a boss fight, where you may have something like with the second mission, that last boss can end up fully aggroing you, and in those moments, if you have the capability of perfectly timing that dodge, you'll have 25% more damage towards that next gun strike. And right after that, when it comes down to the melee weapon, the number one is going to be the Power Sword, for the simple fact that it has the capability of having speed style and power style. Power style is going to end up being the better of the two options, especially if you're looking to bully and stagger most of those elite units and do it with relative ease. Every one of your light attacks with the power style is going to have the capability of juggling not only one of the elite units, but if you have multiple of the elite units kind of stacked on top of each other, you do have a bit of AoE with this cleaving, and you'll be able to basically juggle multiple of those units, and it can make it quite easy to start cutting them down and basically taking off their aggro from the team and being able to move them into that perfect parry window, which is the ideal build for the Bulwark. If you haven't checked that out, check it out on the channel. I've already got that best in slot Bulwark build out there, so hit that subscribe button if you're looking for more of these class build loadouts in the coming future. And the most ideal power sword you're looking for is any one of them that has the fencing quality to it, and you do want to end up having a little bit of speed on top of that. The purple variants are going to be the most irritating, as they seem to be the slowest out of all of them. It's one of those hurdles that once you get past the purple variant, you'll be feeling much better with the power sword, because the 2 speed on that is very sluggish, and I'd almost say you're better off using the balanced one once you get to the purple variation, just because that has additional speed to it. But when it comes down to the perk tree, we're going across the top. We're going to make sure that we're starting off with armored strength. Sadly enough, this is one of those that I don't prefer having. I would much rather have the 5% increase to damage, but we need to start off on the top to make sure that we get the most benefit out of the perk tree. But just after that, while switching the combat style, so switching from speed to power, will gain an additional 20% melee damage for 5 seconds. So sometimes it may be ideal to switch that power style or that style every once in a while just to gain that 20%. But the big thing right after that is the momentum gain. This is one of the larger ones that's going to further increase our DPS output, where each consecutive light attack increases our light attack melee by 3%. And sometimes it may be ideal to switch to speed style, rack this up to 30%, and then switch over to power style. So maybe just churn through some of those smaller crowds and then have that maximum 30% to start working on some of those elite units. It can work out quite well. But just after that, we'll also have speed style combo length increase from 4 to 5. This can benefit us with being able to switch to that speed style and rack up that 30% as quickly as possible. And just after that, we've got Chaos Slayer, just further increasing our damage output towards those Chaos enemies. Just underneath that, we've got Tyranid Slayer, which is going to further increase our damage towards the Tyranid. And just after that, we've got Hard Target, which, while performing our light combos, which we'll be utilizing quite often, will take 15% less range damage. Since we're swinging that sword all day, this is going to benefit us in the long run. And just after that, Reeling Blow, enemies hit with our Power Rake, which is going to be our heavy strike. After 3 strikes from the power style, we'll be able to just land that last one with this, and each one of those units that are being hit with this Power Rake are going to deal 30% less damage for 4 seconds. This is great for dealing with any one of those groups of elite units. We can actually kind of land more than a few hits with this on those enemies, as it will go forward in a little bit of a cone, so you will be able to hit multiple enemies with this Power Rake. So those elite units will end up dealing 30% less damage in those moments. And just after that, we've got Majora's Slayers. Any one of those elite units will be dealing with an additional 10% damage on top of that. And since we will be using the Power Sword in most instances with a boss fight, as it is our primary weapon, Terminus level enemies, our boss units, are going to take 20% additional damage. And coming up right after that, when it comes down to the sniper class, one of my personal favorite from the first game, the Last Cannon, or what they call it now is the Last FUSIL, is going to be the ultimate sniper's weapon. This thing is going to be able to 2-shot pretty much any one of the elite units. Sometimes you will be able to get 1 shot on them. I am still working on a build for this where I believe the one perk that's giving you 75% increased damage once you break the cloak is not actually working, but the perk where you sit still for 2 seconds and gain 20% increase to damage, I have found myself being capable of, with 1 shot, been able to put the elite units into their finisher state, where you can just go up and be able to finish them off. Sadly, this is very inconsistent though, and it is all based on your shot placement. I believe you will need to be center mass with a lot of the units' faces. Otherwise, if you're hitting somewhere off on the edges, you more than likely aren't dealing enough damage in those moments, as it does seem to be a beam that you can enlarge when it comes down to the perk tree. But overall, I'd say you're better off just increasing the overall DPS output of it. But it is one of the more fantastic weapons, and it can clear through those elite units and have some very beefy damage towards some of those boss units, especially if you've got somebody on the tactical side, further increasing that overall DPS output from the scan itself. It can be pretty devastating. And when it comes to leveling the las cannon, I would highly suggest going with the one that further increases the magazine capacity. This is going to be a big issue for this weapon, especially if you don't have a heavy on the team, further increasing the total of maximum magazine capacity that we have available to us. If you do have that on your team, it's going to be a big benefit, but you will be able to churn through these rounds pretty quickly. And if you're not the best shot, I will tell you right now, you're more than likely going to be wasting a lot of these and find yourself stuck with the pistol and the combat knife more often than not. But they're still going to be benefited from the fact that you will have quite a bit of headshot damage from your perk tree and the capability of being able to go invisible quite often. I will be putting out a best in slot sniper build coming in the future, so hit that subscribe button. We've got plenty more of that content coming in the future. But when it comes down to the perk tree, we're going straight across the top. Shots charge 15% faster. We're gaining the capability of shots charging even faster once we're below 30 health, which may happen sometimes, quite often, sadly enough. But right after that, we've got Headhunter, even more of that headshot damage, and an additional one right after that. We've already got 20%, and we do end up having a little bit of a healing capability from this if we wanted to just kind of shoot this into a crowd of those smaller units. There is a perk on the skill tree for the sniper class that does have the capability of regaining a charge anytime that we spend one and we kill more than just one enemy. So if you just kill 2 of those smaller units, you'll basically just get a free charge back. So in those moments, you can just kind of churn through some of those crowds with some of these shots and not be wasting ammo and kind of use it for crowd control. But I wouldn't say this is always the best bet, but it can benefit you. But just above that, we'll gain an additional headshot damage. We got 30% now. And just across from that, if we kill 3 enemies or more in one shot, we restore 5% of our health, and this can be pretty beneficial later on if you do find yourself in a situation where you're low on health, but you have the capability of just firing off into one of those crowds of smaller units. This thing will burn through all of them. It has penetration power of just melting through all of them like a laser beam. It's fantastic, and this should be pretty easy for you to get done in order to gain some of that health back in certain situations. But right after that, we also have Perpetual Velocity, which is going to charge our shots even faster by another 15%. And the number one thing that we really want out of this is charging immunity. While charging a shot, you do not lose control from heavy hits. So even if something's firing at us, we won't be getting knocked back. We'll still be able to land that shot, or even against a boss unit. That is going to be very beneficial for us with this class. So it's just going to give us the capability of constantly being able to maintain that DPS output. And when it comes down to our secondary and our melee weapon, they are both going to be the only weapon that we have, which is the bolt pistol and the combat knife. And if you've already leveled these up on previous classes, you're going to be just fine. They're going to be laid out exactly like they were for the other classes. And last but not least, we've got the heavy class, which this one, the talk of the town, you may have seen it already. The number one primary weapon for this is going to be the MELTA. It is an absolute powerhouse. If you've used this in the campaign, it was a destructive force. I loved it personally myself, and I'm loving it even more in the operations. I haven't played too much with it, but I've seen more than a few people rolling around with this, and it is self-healing. It is very destructive. It is melting through those crowds, and you're going to do just fine, basically being this massive tank, just pushing in with this heavy class with the MELTA. It is an absolute powerhouse. And when it comes down to the perk tree, what I would highly suggest is starting off with the top row, moving across from increased capacity over to elite restoration, heavy fire, and then heavy immunity. This one's going to be a big one that just gives you the capability of any time that you aim down sights or basically just aim forward with this, that's going into heavy stance. You just won't lose control from heavy hits. That way you can just keep firing away with that MELTA instead of getting pushed back. And then just after that, we've got the after a finisher. Our fire rate is increased by 25% per 5 seconds, further increasing our DPS output, and more than likely you will be performing quite a few finishers with this weapon. You'll be putting a lot of those elite units into that finisher state with this weapon. And just after that, we will have the while in heavy stance will deal 15% more damage, and from this point we'll go downward towards the fast regeneration, double up on that, and then the HP, just to make sure that we're getting armor and health back from this. So anytime that we're below 30% health and we kill a Majoris level unit or higher, basically with a finisher, since it says melee damage, we'll be gaining 5% of that health, which in reality ends up being like 25%. So this is a way that we can start to self-heal along with just kind of churning through those crowds and just gaining armor every time that we're just melting through those smaller units, which, trust me, you are going to be burning through crowds with this thing, and it's going to be a good time. But I will say, if you're not really worried about health consumption and you want to just maximize the overall damage output, you could just put 1 point into the HP and then just head straight across on the top row all the way over until you hit the point of Death Strike, which after killing a Majora's level enemy or higher with a melee weapon, which anytime that you just finish one of those off, you're basically gaining another 25% damage for 5 seconds right after that, and then you can also get the ammo reserve increase of 20% for the multi-melta, which is going to be a huge benefit for you. So it's going to be up to your personal preference whether you want that kind of tanky healing variation of it, or if you just want that full-on pushed in through the crowd and just melt everything that you see. And if you're playing with a bulwark, more than likely that may end up being the better route for you, as you just want to have maximum DPS while you're just gaining all the armor from their banner drops. And like I stated before, the same reason we wanted the plasma pistol for the bulwark class is the same reason we want it for the heavy classes. It does give us the capability at range, especially if you're using the multi-melta. This will give us the capability of stopping those elite units from calling in those reinforcements with just one shard shot, as well as giving us a little bit of range and a little bit more DPS, and being able to just switch to this pretty quickly to pick off some of those smaller units maybe as well. And since we're the heavy class, we'll have much more ammo with this as a part of the perk tree. But one thing to add just at the end is, if you're not looking to be up close and personal like with the multi-melta and you still want something that has that crowd control, that DPS capability, the heavy bolter is going to be one good time. I've been using it personally and I've quite enjoyed it, and it's definitely one that I would highly suggest picking up if you're not looking to be up in the face of all those enemies, or if you're having a little bit of trouble using the multi-melta. Sometimes it may just not be your playstyle and you just may not be benefiting from it that much, as you will need to be churning through crowds in order to sustain yourself. So maybe sometimes the heavy bolter staying at a bit of mid-range or a bit of long range and being able to just kind of tap fire that heavy bolter and just lay some of those rounds down range in large amounts could end up being the better playstyle for you. But that's going to be it for the best weapons that you want to level up early with each one of the classes. Hopefully it's been beneficial for you. Hopefully it's given you a little bit more insight as to what you should be going for with each one of the classes, or maybe something that's given you a little bit of a perked interest in some of these classes as to what type of playstyle you may be rolling in with, as a lot of these different weapons, these primary weapons, can be synergized with some of the perk trees for each one of these classes, and it can be quite interesting. There's a whole lot of builds that I'll be doing in the future, and there's a bunch of fun to be had with some of these classes, and more than a few of these weapons. And some of these weapons do end up kind of shaking up the playstyle or even the classes build in general. So I may be playing around with more than a few builds for some of these different classes that may not be the greatest, but could end up being a good time. So be sure to hit that subscribe button. We got plenty more of that content coming in the future, and some breakdowns on some of these classes and how to utilize some of these weapons to the fullest of their extent, as it would be too long in order to just kind of go through every bit of the details on how to use each one of these weapons, or at least in this video, as it's probably already too long, and as it's probably already too long at this point, as long as I've been talking through each one of these. But hopefully you stuck around all the way to the finish, and let me know down in the comments below what's your favorite class right now, what's the weapon of choice for you, and if there's anything that I didn't key highlight when it came to some of these weapons, let me know down below. We'll pin some of those comments for some of those other people out there. Maybe there's something I missed or I haven't played around with that may end up being one of the better options out there. But on that note, if you'd like to see more content like this in the future, hit that subscribe button, and if you'd like to see some of this content live, hit that link down in the description below. Follow me over at Twitch. We'll be streaming daily, and on that note, have a good one.